If you did not know this already, Abilene is a pretty interesting place. It is not really a small town, but kind of gives off that small town feeling. There's four universities, a zoo, and a church on every corner, which just is a really interesting combination to think about. But in all seriousness, what strikes me as the most interesting thing about Abilene is a large homeless population that call Abilene home. According to some studies, there are potentially over 300 homeless people in Abilene, which is really crazy to think about. Since going to school at ACU, a couple of my friends and I have been doing our own homeless ministry outreach. We usually take our bean butts or campus cash, get food on campus, and then bring it to those who are on the street. And we try to have an intentional conversation with them, trying to show them that they matter as a person, as a human being. A stereotype that goes with homeless people a lot of the time is that they are in these situations because they're either lazy, are drug addicts, or have some sort of alcohol abuse. Which some homeless people I have encountered have said the latter is the case for this situation. But most of the time I've talked to homeless people, that is really rarely the case. A lot of them say it's from losing a job, a family or a family member, battling a mental illness or a chronic disease, going bankrupt from trying to pay off medical bills, or just being neglected. Life hasn't been fair for them. Yet despite their circumstances, every time I encounter a homeless person, they always want to pray and talk about Jesus. They are proud to call themselves Christians, and they usually say something along the lines of like, Jesus, yeah, that's my guy, or we're walking his walk and living his life. And a person in particular that I'll never forget is Jason. A friend and I met Jason a couple years ago in the winter in the middle of an intersection as he was begging for food. Jason said he was in this stage of life because he lost his job and had no family, no place to go, or no financial resources to fall back on. And he told us that he had to constantly be moving around town to different spots to be begging for food because if he didn't, other people will start to get territorial and potentially even kill him. And though amidst his difficulties, Jason always knew that God was going to provide for him. And I remember him telling us that you don't need to be religious. Don't get caught up in religion. But what you need to have is faith in God. That is what it's truly about. Yet that seems easier said than done. Some circumstances, some conditions just never seem to end, kind of like the season of life we're all experiencing now in the pandemic with so much sickness. A lot of us are sacrificing our regular routines and schedules and are fearful of what's going to happen next. However, thankfully, the Gospel of Mark reassures us that that's not how our story with Jesus Christ is going to end. Which brings me to my text in Mark 5, which is about a dead girl and a sick woman, and we're beginning in verse 21, which says, "When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue rulers named Jairus came there. Seeing Jesus, he fell at his feet and pleaded earnestly with him, 'My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her, so that she will be healed and live.' So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and pressed around him, and a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had. Yet, instead of getting better, she grew worse." The role of who is clean and unclean plays a significant role in the Gospel of Mark, especially in our story of a dead girl and a sick woman. The book of Leviticus has many chapters designated to what to do in situations when somebody is considered unclean, specifically in regards to discharges of blood. Usually it was custom for when a woman was on her menstrual cycle, or if a man or somebody else dealt with blood, they had to remove themselves from the rest of the community of believers until the blood had ceased, and then stay another week in isolation before returning. No one is supposed to have contact or anything to do with somebody who is in isolation, or then themselves would become impure and unclean and have to go into isolation themselves. But once somebody was cleansed of their blood, took the week, they were welcomed back into the community. Yet for this woman, it was not just a week. It was 12 long years. This woman has not just been in physical pain, but has been socially outcasted. She has been isolated from synagogues, religious festivals, holidays, and anything pertaining to the religious community of faith. And this woman could not rely on her family and or a husband if she had one, because if they were to be righteous followers of God, they would not associate with somebody who is unclean, then, because if they touched that person, then they would be unclean and have to go into isolation. In the ancient world, a woman was only known and worth anything in regards to her family, specifically her husband. Yet because of her condition, this woman, her life is a living death sentence. Yet, as we see in the first few chapters of the Gospel of Mark, and in the beginning of this chapter, when Jesus heals a demon-possessed man, Jesus does not care about these social and religious norms to stay away from those who are unclean so he won't become impure. Rather, he seeks out those who have those predicaments. And in our case, he actually walks right into it. Which brings us back to our text, starting in verse 27, where it says, "When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I'll be healed. Immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, 'Who touched my clothes?' 'You see the people crowding against you,' his disciples answered, 'and yet you can ask, who touched me?' But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. He said to her, 'Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering.'" And just like that, 12 years of suffering, of pain has ceased. A simple touch of Jesus' cloak, and this woman is miraculously healed. And Jesus does not even seem to intentionally heal this woman, but he is so filled with the healing power, it is just in his nature to bring healing to these desperate situations. Though she is freed from her suffering and seemingly healed in verse 29, she comes fearfully trembling before Jesus, telling him the whole truth of what happened, and Jesus responds in verse 34 by saying, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." Jesus could have easily ignored this touch, like he did with the rest of the crowd that was pressing in on him, trying to get to him, and had gone straight to Jairus' house. Yet, he chooses to reassure this woman's desperate plea that the blood has just not ceased, but she will not be forgotten. The woman is now the daughter of the one true King, which shows she is not just well, but holistically healed, transformed, and restored. According to the CDC, there are approximately 1.7 million cases around the world of COVID-19, and around over 108,000 people have sadly died from it, and those numbers will inevitably grow. Schools are shut down, churches aren't able to meet, and people everywhere are in despair. Sadly, this year we couldn't celebrate Easter together with our church communities or our extended families, which is sad and kind of brings a downcast to the holiday. Things seem hopeless right now. But so did things at that first Easter. When the disciples saw their Savior die on a cross, a lot of them went to their homes scared, fearful, grieving that they were next. Yet, Friday and Saturday did not last forever. Sunday eventually came around. We can hope in Jesus because he can enter into any situation and come up on top, including the most hopeless and desolate situations. Jumping back into Mark chapter 5, starting again in verse 35, it says, "While Jesus was still speaking, some men came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue ruler. 'Your daughter is dead,' they said. 'Why bother the teacher anymore?' Ignoring what they said, Jesus told the synagogue ruler, 'Don't be afraid, just believe.' He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the home of the synagogue ruler, Jesus saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, 'Why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead but asleep.' But they laughed at him. After he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother, the disciples who were with him, and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, 'Talitha koum,' which means, 'Little girl, I say to you, get up.' Immediately the girl stood up and walked around. She was 12 years old. At this, they were completely astonished. He gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this and told them to give her something to eat." We are suddenly reminded that this story did not start with a sick woman with a perpetual bleeding, but actually started with Jairus' very sick daughter, who we now come to find out by some of Jairus' men is now sadly dead. "Why bother the teacher anymore?" the men say. "He wasted too much time with this woman. Jesus did not do what we wanted him to do. What's the point anymore?" Jairus didn't even get to ask for healing for his daughter. However, Jesus, like always, responds in a very interesting way to Jairus and his men by saying, "Don't be afraid, just believe." And Jairus is probably thinking to himself, "Yeah, I did that. I believed, and this is what it led to. What are you talking about?" However, the word used for believe here in verse 36 in the original Greek is pisteuo, which is commonly translated as having a confidence or reliability in, a saving faith. Why was Jesus so calm in this desperate situation? Why wasn't he rushing to save this little girl? Because unlike the rest of us, Jesus is not restrained by time and has the power to raise the dead to life. Jesus goes into the most hopeless situation, a little girl's tomb, and says to the people who are crying, "Stop crying. Little girl, rise up. We're going to be okay." Everyone is astonished by Jesus raising the little girl, but the chapter ends, like a lot of the chapters do in the first half of Mark, with a strange and weird ending, with Jesus telling everyone in Jairus' home not to tell what had just transpired. Why wouldn't people want to know that Jesus, early in this chapter, healed a demon-possessed man, healed a woman who had been bleeding for 12 years, and now just raised a little girl from the dead? Sadly, we don't get that answer at the end of the Mark chapter 5. But thankfully, a few chapters later in Mark 8, Jesus finally reveals for the first time to his disciples that he is not here to overthrow the Roman government or to restore riches back to the Jews. Rather, he is here to die for all of humanity on a cross. A lot of people in Jesus' ministry, and particularly in the story, think that he is amazing. What he does is such an amazement to watch and is so cool. But amazement is not faith. It is one thing to think that Jesus is cool, but it is another thing to trust Jesus during times of desperation, on the brink of losing everything, to trust that his words will be true, and to follow him knowing that means it leads to the cross. However, literal physical death is not the death of hope, because on the cross, Jesus fulfills holistic, complete restoration and healing of all mankind. Scholar M. Eugene Boring says it best that believers are not asked whether they believe once upon a time Jesus raised a little girl from the dead, but are challenged to believe that once for all time God raised Jesus from the dead. In a time where we are seemingly pressed from all angles, millions losing their jobs, thousands becoming sick and sadly even dying, Jesus is the calm in it all and continues to focus on us and our own situations and hurts. And like to this little girl, Jesus says to us, rise up, bring your hurt, and follow me. Though this current season of life, with a lot of uncertainty, stress, anxiety, sickness, and even death, might not end when we hope, Jesus continues to call out to us by saying, keep coming. We are going to walk through this together. And that is always encouraging to know that the God who endured sin, death, and hell for us is the one who is currently comforting us along this journey.